Hello, everybody. It's Walter, your favorite historian, educator, professor, and social studies extraordinaire, here today to give you a follow-up of class number 7 in U.S. History 2, where we discussed the Roaring Twenties, aka the 1920s or the Jazz Age, folks. Now, the 1920s was a very happening period in American history, ladies and gentlemen. Arguably, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times, depending on who you were and where you stood in American society. Okay? Now, the 20s was a very progressive era, arguably, but it was also a very reactive era, beyond question. And again, it all depended on your outlook, all right, and where you were in that society that typically guided how you would perceive that era. So the 1920s began, with lots of people, still very, very tired of the effects of World War I, the high taxes, the inflation, the increased internationalism of the United States, the government regulations of the economy, all of which were fairly new to the American people. All right, and a lot of people certainly wanted what became known as a return to normalcy. Okay, normalcy meant getting rid of all of this hoopla and mess created by the First World War, and to basically return the country to what it was back in, 1913. Okay, so with every new decade, you see a lot of progress, and you also see a lot of reaction. Okay, and that, folks, was reaction, and this would become a very Republican decade. Okay, starting with the 1920 presidential election, Republican candidates Warren G. Harding and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, would certainly embrace the return to normalcy philosophy of getting the federal government out of managing the economy, letting business essentially run things, okay? Letting America flourish, letting prosperity go unchecked, all right? Essentially letting businesses and Wall Street do whatever they want. And we see what kind of trouble that would later get us into, okay? So American people were tired of all of what the Democrats under Wilson had imposed upon them. Again, price control, censorship, internationalism, regulations on the economy, and they were tired of it. And so as a result of the 1920 presidential election, Harding won in a blowout, ladies and gentlemen, winning 61% of the popular vote, 404 electoral votes over his Democratic opponent, James Cox of Ohio, who had consequently a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt on his ticket as vice president. Okay, so Harding's election to the presidency issued in a very, very conservative yet open-minded presidency that was focused on laissez-faire economics, letting businesses flourish, getting the United States out of international entanglements, all the while promoting world peace. Now, Harding, of himself, was a very honest guy, but he surrounded himself with a lot of corrupt people, which is the unfortunate circumstance of a lot of presidents. And a few people in his cabinet, even ended up going to prison. Harding himself was never connected with any of these corrupt dealings, and thankfully never was. Unfortunately, he died in San Francisco in August 1923 due to natural causes, and was succeeded in the presidency by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, aka number 30, or Silent Cal. Coolidge came to the presidency having never sought said office. Okay, he was a very different man than Harding. Coolidge, unlike Harding, was a very straight-laced, proper New England Puritan type of individual. If he smoked or drank, I don't believe he smoked, at all. But with respect to drinking, Coolidge certainly would have kept that out of the public eye. I don't believe he was a drinker either, but he was a very starchy, straight-laced type of guy who had a very dry sense of humor, okay? And he was a man of few words, all right, preferring deeds, all right? Coolidge is a very overlooked president in American history, best known for presiding over the United States during most of the 1920s and promoting the hands-off attitude toward government intervention in the economy. I mean, he viewed it almost as a sin for the federal government to be regulating the economy, okay? And that was the predominant theme of the Coolidge presidency. But what Coolidge is best known for, ladies and gentlemen, Outside of that is his broad support for civil rights for African Americans, for Native Americans, and for women. In his very first State of the Union, Coolidge delivered a passionate plea for Congress to pass a federal anti-lynching law to protect African Americans, okay, as well as to promote kindness and reconciliation between blacks and whites throughout the country. He also urged more federal spending, ironically, on vocational and otherwise medical training for blacks at Howard University. Very, very powerful thing, all right? Something that Coolidge is almost never cited for. He also delivered the 1924 commencement at Howard University and was definitely a friend to African Americans. He deplored the Ku Klux Klan to the core and hated racism. He refused at one point to declare that America was a white man's country, all right? Coolidge hated the type of MAGA racism that you see today. He was a very powerful supporter of Native Americans, signing the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 into law, which gave full American citizenship to all Native Americans who had not yet been naturalized. In spite of that, however, many states continued to deny them the ballot up until the 1960s. Okay? The 20s were also a very prominent era with respect to music. Like I said, it was known as the Jazz Age, folks. And you see jazz explode in popularity, being heard in nightclubs all throughout the country. Within the decade, you also see the commencement and the growth of the movie industry. You see Hollywood in its earliest stages, okay? You see automobiles, all right, become a more commonplace thing with millions of people being able to own them, specifically the Model T, which Henry Ford made much more affordable, all right? Ford was a landmark individual in his own right because he made the Model T accessible to most Americans, but also allowed for his workers to be paid $5 a day, set their workday at 8 hours, okay, and paid his black and white workers equally, which, guess what, was not common, okay? You see air travel begin to take off in this era, all right, with Lindbergh's flight to Europe and Bessie Coleman, all right, making air travel seemingly something that is more palatable to the average person. And especially with Lindbergh's flight to Europe, it is now seen that airplanes can cross the ocean, and you see air travel and airline industries begin to grow and develop in the 1920s. Okay? You also see appliances come to the average person's home: radios, record players, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines and refrigerators and other things, all right, which truly make the 1920s a very influential decade. You also see the growth of radio, the growth of sports, all right, and lots of media reaching levels that it never previously had. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge was elected to the presidency a full term, destroying the Democratic as well as the progressive opposition, all right? Also in this decade, you see a lot of backlash thanks to nativism, all right? You see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in this decade to come back after 50 years of virtual extermination. You see a lot of conflict between faith, fundamentalism, and science, conflict over evolution and creationism, okay? And you see a lot of young people breaking away from the traditional Victorian mores and coming into themselves and finding themselves, all right? And you find this definitely be true with women. You see the Harlem Renaissance and the explosion of African-American literary as well as music profiles and politicians, okay? Notably, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Adam Clayton Powell, Claude McKay, lots of people, all right? With the Great Migration to the North, you see black people definitely make their mark throughout the northern United States in this time period. And of course, prohibition is definitely in full swing and full force, barely being enforced, all right, and resulting in a lot of crime and violence, all right, and others such as Al Capone and other prominent people at this time making a lot of money off of breaking the law. In 1928, Hoover would be elected to the presidency, taking us into the third straight Republican victory, thinking prosperity would last forever, all right, and the decade closes on a good note initially until he becomes president, and then everything goes straight to hell a few months later. So that's the 1920s. Any questions or controversies, leave them at the bottom and let me know. Thanks for listening. Professor Shelton out.